I think Trump thinks that he has a personal relationship with Putin. I think Trump thinks that he's friends with Putin, that Putin respects him, and none of that is true.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've spoken to Kyiv-based journalist and foreign policy and security expert Jimmy Rushton. He's spoken to us about Vladimir Putin's visit to the front lines, but was it really the front lines? He doesn't think he was anywhere close to the action. We've spoken to him about what it's like right now in Ukraine, how it feels to have that US intelligence and military back. Did troops even feel the loss of it for that week that it was gone? Negotiations will kick off today with Putin and the US to discuss this 30-day ceasefire. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us Monday through Friday, every day on Times Radio's YouTube. Jimmy Rushton, Kyiv-based foreign policy and security expert and on-the-ground journalist, thank you for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we've got to start timely. You and I have spoken off camera quite a lot about Vladimir Putin's visit to Kursk, a region of which Ukraine had occupied around August last year. It seems that Russia are kind of taking back the area a little bit, but Putin has visited his troops and what looks like, I guess, heroic take from him. He's dressed in his military gear, he's meeting his troops, but it's not all that it seems to be, is it?
No, we looked at where the video was filmed. Me and a friend of mine were almost 70 or 80% sure that he's visiting a military base in the city of Kursk, which is about 80, 90 kilometers from the front line. So he's really nowhere near the front. He's just, he's putting on his military uniform, and it's all a bit of theatre, to be honest. And this contrasts very unfavourably with even some other, high-profile Russian figures. So, like Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was the leader of the Wagner mercenary group, he was repeatedly visiting the front line. He was in Bakhmut, put himself at considerable danger. Zelensky, from the Ukrainian side, he's repeatedly been to the front line as well. He was also in Bakhmut on the Ukrainian side. He was in Kherson immediately after it was liberated. So, Putin, he's never been one to want to put himself in situations where his personal safety could be threatened. You can just remember the situation during COVID where he had that absolutely massive table and was sitting as physically, as far away as physically possible from all of the people that he would meet. So, yeah, a bit of theatre, to be honest.
Especially when it comes to his health, Jimmy, because there's been quite a lot of speculation in the last few years over his health and if he's actually got cancer or if he's got a health condition. So that coupled with the fact that if he was actually entering the front lines, an area of which Ukraine had kind of somewhat occupied, he would be a bit of a sitting duck.
Yeah, absolutely. If the Ukrainians could get a hold of his location, they would absolutely try and hit it. So yeah, it makes perfect sense for him to not go anywhere near the front line. But at the same time, you shouldn't really pretend that you are, because obviously people will find out, and then you'll look slightly ridiculous. But again, it's all for Russian domestic audiences. He wants to show that he's a big, tough war leader in his military uniform, and it will probably, unfortunately, be successful for Russian domestic audience because they're not the most sophisticated of audiences, unfortunately.
But it is kind of weird because most military experts or even kind of comments from, I guess, North Korea's point of view, Putin doesn't care about his troops.
No, he doesn't. He's perfectly happy to expend as many Russian soldiers' lives in these, desperate, the Ukrainians call them meat wave assaults against the Ukrainian lines. And the level of callousness which the Russian military shows towards its soldiers is astonishing, really. Basic lack of care, respect, human dignity afforded to their own people. So, he doesn't care about his soldiers. No, that's obviously true. He will occasionally visit injured soldiers, give them awards for propaganda purposes, but, it's obvious that he doesn't care about their lives or their well-being.
Jimmy, as the fighting continues, I spoke to a military British expert earlier in the week who said that Russian troops are very untrained. They're not experts in any sort of field. They're using pretty crappy artillery and tanks, and a lot of them are just conscripts that have been plucked from conscription and straight into the war zone. When you're speaking to your Ukrainian sources within the military, is that what they're finding, that the Ukrainian troops are a lot more experienced than the Russians?
So it's mostly true. What is definitely true is that a lot of the Russian military equipment is old. They've been reduced to using a lot of civilian vehicles now because a lot of the dedicated military vehicles, tanks, APCs, IFVs, etc., have been destroyed or just worn out from so much use. What isn't actually true, and a lot of people get this wrong, is that most of the soldiers currently fighting in Ukraine on Russia's side are not conscripts. They're actually volunteers. And these are people that have been motivated by large financial incentives to come and fight. They are not the mobilized guys, the conscripts that we saw, say, last year or the year before. It's primarily volunteers. So again, these are people that knew what they were getting into and were swayed by the promises of large financial settlements, and also potentially the idea that the war might be over soon, and the thought that they could potentially cash in, get this big payment up front, and then be demobilized relatively quickly.
Well, I guess the jury's out if the war will be over soon, but last week, Jimmy, the US halted military aid and intelligence to Ukraine. Within the week, they've invoked it again, so they've been allowed to have that very, very important intelligence and aid that Ukraine so desperately needs. For that week period where they were without it, and from your discussions with people in the military, did they feel the loss of that?
So they definitely felt the loss. In regards to the military aid, there's obviously a lag between the US cutting off supplies and that actually having an impact on the front, because obviously it takes quite a while for military aid to arrive. It then has to go through the logistics chain before it gets to the guys fighting on the front or the air defense units shooting down Russian missiles. So it didn't have that much of an impact, to be honest. Obviously, in terms of psychological terms, it had more of an impact because for the Ukrainians, all of a sudden having this vital lifeline cut off was it was incredibly worrying. And going into these talks in Saudi Arabia, the key objective for the Ukrainians, it really wasn't this ceasefire. It was getting the military aid pipeline back on. So getting the trucks rolling from Poland. Again, that was their absolutely number one objective, and they've managed to achieve that. So that will definitely be viewed as a big win. And same with intelligence. The intelligence sharing has been very important, but it definitely hasn't caused them to lose ground in Kursk. I know that for a fact. I've spoken to a number of Ukrainian figures, both regular soldiers and people in the government, and it made life difficult for them, but it wasn't the cause of their misfortune in Kursk. Unfortunately, that was a longer time coming, and that was quite an effective Russian campaign of degrading Ukrainian logistics, and just flooding the combat zone in Kursk with a stupid amount of troops. Some of the best Russian drone operators went to Kursk because it was obviously imperative for Putin to kick the Ukrainians out of Kursk for political reasons.
And I think because it was only a week, and a week is a long time in war years, but because it was just that week, I guess we didn't get to see the full scale of effect that it would have had if it went on for a month or so. But Jimmy, according to reports, Russia has made some advances in the last few weeks in terms of occupying more land of Ukraine. If Putin's army continues to do so, they continue to make this advance into Ukraine, will a peace deal even be enticing for Putin?
So I think you need to separate Kursk and what's happening in Ukraine, because if you look at some of the fighting in Ukraine, it's actually been going in the Ukrainians' direction recently. So you've seen around the city of Toretsk, you've seen the Ukrainians making significant advances and pushing the Russians back out of the majority of the city, around Pokrovsk, some of the villages to the south of Pokrovsk, where Russia was advancing, attempting to cut that city off. The Ukrainians have made advances there too. Around Chasiv Yar, again, the Ukrainians have been making advances. So, if you look at the fighting in Ukraine, it's been going Ukraine's way. If you look at the fighting, obviously in Russia, in Kursk, it hasn't. But then again, one of the chief objectives of the Kursk operation in the first place was to pull Russian troops away from fighting in Ukraine to try and give the Ukrainians fighting in Donbass an easier time of it, and that seems to have worked. And the Russians, I mean, they've taken incredible casualties in Kursk because they've been fighting to this political deadline set by Putin, and they've been taking astonishing casualties there. So, they have been losing territory in Kursk, but they were never going to hold it long term, and they were probably going to trade it away in negotiations. So in that regard, it's not great. But again, it was territory they were always going to lose at some point.
Reports this week from two undisclosed sources have claimed that Russia has continued in the last few weeks as negotiations had happened. Any time Russia and the US have had any conversations, they've basically presented the US with a list of demands that they want. While it's not really known what exactly these demands are, it's not made public what the Kremlin have asked of the United States. Do you have any intel or I guess speculation as to what you think the Kremlin would be asking the US in order to broker this peace deal?
Well, the key demand that I've heard is that they want US military aid to Ukraine to stop. If you listen to the Russian military bloggers, and they're one of the best sources of information from the kind of Russian security establishment, they're relatively unfiltered, although there are lines that they know that they can't cross. But they've been saying, well, if we agree to a 30-day ceasefire or whatever, the Ukrainians will just rearm, they'll get more military aid from the US, and it won't be particularly good for us. So I think the number one demand from Russia will be that the US stop supplying military aid to Ukraine, which obviously the Ukrainians wouldn't accept, that because they would view that they would be, Russia will continue to rearm during this 30-day period, continue to rotate troops. And then at the end of this 30-day period, the Russia will just start fighting again, and the Ukrainians will have no more US weapons, and that won't be good for them, obviously.
Well, Steve Witkoff, he's arrived in Moscow to begin his negotiations and chats with Vladimir Putin and his team to discuss signing this 30-day ceasefire that Ukraine has signed off on. Trump has threatened Russia if he doesn't sign it. The consensus is the ball is now in Russia's court. He says, I can do things financially that would be very bad for Russia. I don't want to do that because I want to get peace. Hopefully we can get a ceasefire from Russia. I've gotten some positive messages, but a positive message means nothing. This is a very serious situation. Do you think this threat of hitting his economy where it hurts will actually go far?
No, not really. I think that the only threat that would mean anything to Putin would be the potential threat to significantly increase the supplies of military aid to Ukraine. From the Russian perspective, they've outlasted us, speak about the West and Ukraine in regards to the economic pressure. The Russian economy isn't doing great, but it's not on the verge of collapsing. So they probably think, well, we can continue to outlast them, and we can probably, put up with a little bit more pain compared to the alternative, which is to agreeing to a ceasefire that they, at the moment, don't view as being in their interests. They are on the verge of kicking Ukraine out of Kursk, and they believe that, in the long term, they can definitely outlast Ukraine. They can definitely outlast Western support for Ukraine.
So you don't think that those comments by Trump was Trump kicking Putin to the curb?
I think Trump thinks that he has a personal relationship with Putin. I think Trump thinks that he's friends with Putin, that Putin respects him, and none of that is true. Putin sees Trump as someone who can be manipulated. He sees him as, he doesn't see him as his equal. He sees him as, fascinated with personal wealth and, the illusion of personal power. And that's something Putin can quite easily manipulate. I think he's been trying to manipulate Trump from day one, and he's been relatively successful at it. I think that where you might see something interesting happening is if Trump actually realizes that he doesn't have this personal friendship with Putin, and that Putin is not doing what he thinks that he should do, which is, come to the terms, sign a peace deal, whatever. At that point, you might see some, the light bulb in Trump's brain flick on. He's like, actually, no, this guy doesn't like me. This guy doesn't respect me. This guy thinks that I'm a bit of a chump. And at that point, something interesting might happen, I think.
So you think the only way Trump can broker this peace deal on his terms, on the basis that the United States is the one that brokers a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, is if Trump threatens Putin with more aid to Ukraine, more military, even perhaps sending troops to Ukraine, basically actually having Ukraine's back?
I don't ever think that he's going to send troops to Ukraine. I think that's never going to happen. But I think significantly increasing military aid is definitely a possibility. I think that there could be additional economic sanctions, but that's not going to do it on its own. So I think massively increased military aid alongside increased sanctions. Potentially on the Russian dark fleet, which is the fleet of tankers which deliver sanctioned Russian oil all around the world. They're under opaque ownership schemes. There's been a lot of attempts to hinder their operations, but they're still sailing around the world right now. I think the other thing that you could potentially look at is if Trump uses his leverage with his Saudi friends. And persuades them to increase oil production, which would lower the price of oil worldwide, and that would significantly impact the Russian economy, which is the majority of their income at the moment is petrochemicals, oil, gas, etc.
So if Putin comes back in this meeting that's taking place later today, Putin's team, they say, no, we're not signing this 30-day ceasefire. Trump will get pissed off. Do you see a world in which Trump says, right, that's it, severing all kind of attempts to have an alliance with Russia, we're now going to send money to Ukraine and they can finish this war on their own terms?
It's possible. The problem with Trump is he's just so erratic that, you could pick any kind of potential outcome and, just spin a dice or whatever and it might happen. I think that if he thinks that he's being personally slighted, then he's willing to change policy on a whim almost. It's a lot of it is down to personal relations, and you saw this in regards to the meeting in the Oval Office with Zelensky. When Trump felt he was disrespected, what did he do? He cut off the military aid, he cut off intelligence sharing. Then when he felt that he was respected because Zelensky sent him a letter apologizing, and then you had the meeting in Jeddah and the Ukrainians presented this ceasefire proposal, Trump felt respected. Trump felt that they were kind of moving towards his position. He turns the military aid back on and he turns the intelligence sharing back on. So I think, again, with him, it's very much about personal relationships. It's about the transactional politics as well. Ukraine has been dangling this minerals deal in front of their faces and telling them how wealthy they can be if they just sign this deal with Ukraine. And the Ukrainians, despite the bust-up in the Oval Office, I think the recent developments they've been quite shrewd in the way they've dealt with it. To be honest, I think everyone's been saying this, but the ball definitely is in Russia's court now because they have to either agree to the ceasefire or they have to risk upsetting Trump. And when you upset Trump, who knows what's going to happen?
If this 30-day ceasefire happens or it doesn't happen, but a peace deal between the two countries is still being negotiated, there are some concessions that Russia might have to give up. We don't know them yet, but there are some that Ukraine will have to give up. One of the main concessions, Jimmy, would be that Zelensky would sign off on giving that 20% of Ukraine that Russia currently occupies, which includes Crimea. Do you see a world in which Zelensky would sign off on that?
No. So what he'll do is he might accept de facto Russian control, but they will never accept de jure Russian control, which is they will never officially sign that territory over to Russia. And Zelensky's been very, very clear on this. The other big sticking point is that Peskov was talking today, Dmitry Peskov, who's Putin's spokesperson, and he said that the entirety of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson are now part of Russia, according to the Russian constitution. So essentially what they're saying is that the entirety of these oblasts, these regions of Ukraine, have to be ceded to Russia. And again, that's not something that Zelensky would ever accept. He wouldn't even accept de facto control of those four oblasts because a significant percentage of particularly Kherson and Zaporizhia are under Ukrainian control, most notably the regional capitals of Kherson, the regional capital of Zaporizhia, and about 1 million Ukrainians live in those two cities. So they're not going to surrender those to Russia. Also, if they did surrender those to Russia, that would give Russia a fantastic position on the right bank of the Dnipro. It would enable Russia to restart the war and basically drive down to Odessa and capture pretty much the entirety of Ukraine's Black Sea coast. So they're not going to do that. They're just not going to do that. And these are irreconcilable differences in these negotiating positions at the moment between Russia and Ukraine.
And I think the US can't really be naive in asking Zelensky to sign off on that, because I don't understand how you could monitor that if you have Russia take over the Eastern Front pretty much. I don't know how you could monitor them not seeping into different areas, pushing in further into Ukraine, especially if they aren't signing a security pact that they would be there, the US would be there in that event that further escalation unfolds. But just a final question, Jimmy, because we don't have long. Tension between the US, UK and Europe, it's been tense, but it seems right now it's simmering just in the public eye. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but if tension does grow and it seems that Europe needs to kind of battle this situation on their own, we can no longer count on the US to be involved in these peace deals. How can Europe and the UK go at this alone?
So actually, me and my co-writer Michael Rice wrote a piece for New Lines magazine where we looked at the possibility of Europe supplying Ukraine alongside, obviously, so not just the EU, but the EU, Norway, the UK, and Turkey as well, which a lot of people forget. Turkey's a huge defense producer. They've got a massive military. They've supplied Ukraine with some significant military aid from the beginning of the war, including the TB2 drones and the DP-ICM cluster munitions. And essentially the result of our investigation was that yes, Europe can supply Ukraine with everything it needs, almost. There's a couple of significant capabilities they couldn't supply, which is the anti-ballistic missile interceptors for the Patriots. But apart from that, particularly due to the fact that this war is now very much a drone war, right? It used to be the majority of the casualties on both sides were caused by artillery. It used to be the case that whoever had the most amount of artillery shells to fling at each other would win whatever particular engagement that you were talking about. But now it's about drones. It's 70 to 80% of casualties on both sides are inflicted by drones. And these drones are commercially available. So all that Europe, the EU, the UK, Turkey, etc. have to do is to purchase mass quantities of these drones and these drone components on the open market and get them to Ukraine. And the good news is that we have the financial power to do that. You know, the combined economies of the EU plus UK plus Turkey is about 25 trillion. Russia's economy is worth like 2.2 trillion, something like that. So we definitely have the economic power. And even if you're looking at conventional defense in industries, Rheinmetall has massively scaled up production of 155mm shells. They're producing something like just over 2 million shells per year by the end of 2026. The Europe absolutely can support Ukraine. It's just a matter of political will, and it's about politicians kind of putting aside domestic squabbling and understanding that this is a key strategic interest for Europe. Because if we don't stop Russia here, it will be a NATO country that's invaded next. And I have friends in Estonia and the Estonian government who absolutely believe this, and they're already building defensive lines along the Latvian, the Lithuanian, and the Estonian border. It's called the Baltic Defence Line Initiative, and they're building that because they genuinely feel that Russia will attack them next. And if they're attacked, that's a NATO Article 5 invocation, and that puts the UK directly in contact with combat with Russia. So it's in everyone's interest. It's in our strategic interest to make sure Ukraine wins, to make sure Russia can't prosecute this war any further outside of Ukraine.
And you can understand why so many people have been barracking for Europe to seize that $300 billion worth of Russian assets and put it into the hands of Ukrainians so they can fight the war, or buy US weaponry if that will not sever ties with the US. But we'll be watching that situation as it unfolds, and the negotiations between Ukraine and the US, which will be taking place today. So, Jimmy Rushton, thank you so much for your expertise as always.
Thank you for having me again.